About 6 months ago, Clark made a decision that would ultimately destroy his marriage to Justinta. At 42 years old, he decided that his sick mother, Eleanor, would move into their home. The most troubling aspect of this decision was that he never consulted Justinta before making such a life-altering choice. Initially, Justinta tried to give Clark the benefit of the doubt. After all, he was an only child, and Eleanor was a widow who had been living alone. She didn't have anyone else to care for her, and the circumstances seemed genuinely dire. Eleanor had apparently contracted hepatitis A and was struggling to care for herself. After several days in the hospital, Clark decided to move her into their home without even checking with his wife first. Justinta's primary issue wasn't with Eleanor moving in. It was with Clark's complete disregard for her input in such a major household decision. They had several heated arguments about this in the beginning, but eventually Justinta tried to understand Clark's position. She agreed to let Eleanor stay until she recovered, especially after Clark explained that his mother already suffered from diabetes and chronic osteoarthritis. These comorbidities, combined with her advanced age, made Clark worry that if something happened to her while she was alone, he would never forgive himself. He wanted to be a good son and care for her in what might be her final years. This explanation touched Justinta's heart. She and Clark had been together for 5 years, married for 3, and she had maintained good relationships with both Clark and Eleanor. She had also gotten along well with Clark's father until he passed away the previous year. Their family relationships had been fairly normal, so Justinta decided to overlook this one incident, even though she felt Clark's approach was wrong. However, once Eleanor moved in, everything changed rapidly, and Justinta could barely keep up with the new demands. Suddenly, she was expected to do twice the work because she worked from home while Clark had to leave for his job each day. Justinta had assumed that Clark would eventually hire a nurse, and she would only need to care for Eleanor for a few days at most while staying home. When she discussed this with Clark, his response shocked her. He told her he had no intention of hiring a nurse because he thought it would be a waste of money since Justinta was going to be home anyway. If Eleanor needed anything, she could simply call out to Justinta. Clark believed that hiring a nurse would be pointless. And even though both he and Justinta made decent incomes, he was being strangely stingy about the situation. This attitude didn't sit right with Justinta at all. They had this discussion almost 2 weeks after Eleanor had moved in. And by then, Justinta was already feeling exhausted from all the pressure. Not only did she have to maintain her professional work, but she also had to help Eleanor with almost everything because she was so weak. Justinta had to feed her, walk her to the bathroom whenever needed, and complete all her household chores alongside these new responsibilities. The worst part was cooking 2 separate meals, one for herself and Clark, and another for Eleanor, who couldn't eat the same food they were having. It was becoming overwhelming. When Justinta brought up her concerns with Clark, she expected sympathy and understanding. Instead, he told her she just had to deal with it because they couldn't afford to spend money on unnecessary things like nursing services. He kept emphasizing that since she worked from home, it would be easy for her to care for Eleanor. She just had to set her mind to it. Clark didn't seem to realize that even though Justinta worked from home, it was still demanding work and it was impossible for her to manage everything simultaneously. Their disagreements escalated into major fights, and that's when their relationship really began deteriorating. Clark refused to understand Justinta's perspective, leaving her feeling helpless because she couldn't abandon Eleanor after how kind the older woman had been to her. After every fight with Clark, Justinta would return to caring for Eleanor, and her mother-in-law would console her, always taking Justinta's side. This made it even harder for Justinta to consider leaving because she had developed an emotional bond with Eleanor. However, looking back, Justinta realized she should have recognized that Eleanor's support was hollow. While she always told Justinta she was right, she never conveyed this to her son, which could have resolved many issues. At one point, Justinta threatened divorce. This threat seemed to wake Clark up because he realized she was serious. He started trying to pacify her and find common ground. Eventually, They agreed that he would take over more household chores and relieve some of Jacinta's duties at home so she could focus on caring for his mother. It wasn't ideal, but it was something, and Jacinta decided to settle for this compromise. This decision proved to be another mistake. While Clark helped out and kept his word for the first couple of months, he soon started slacking off, and Jacinta found herself back in the old routine. Eventually, Eleanor's health did start improving, but not enough for her to help around the house. The situation remained frustrating, and over the past few months, Jacinta had been fighting with Clark more frequently. The only reason Jacinta held on was her love for Clark. No matter how much they fought, they would eventually reconcile. He would apologize for his mistakes and promise to change. For the next couple of weeks, he would actually follow through, but then slowly they would return to their old patterns. Jacinta couldn't count how many times she had forgiven him or how often she had vented to Eleanor about everything going wrong. Eleanor always reassured her that eventually things would improve again. Everything felt like it was falling apart. But a few days ago, Jacinta discovered that everything had indeed fallen apart. Because Eleanor and Clark had been working together to deceive her for months. While searching through their shared cupboard for something, Jacinta accidentally discovered something she probably wasn't supposed to find. Clark had clearly hidden it because there was no other reason he would store Eleanor's medical records in a duffel bag pushed to the very back of their cupboard where it was unlikely to be discovered. Jacinta couldn't understand most of the medical terminology, but she could read the dates. Something felt off about the entire situation, so she decided to take pictures of the papers and send them to her cousin, who happened to be a doctor. After waiting anxiously for a response, she received shocking news. The papers were test results showing that Eleanor had been given a clean bill of health. Based on the dates, Jacinta realized that these results had come back almost 2 months ago. Neither Clark nor Eleanor had told her anything about Eleanor's recovery, even though Jacinta was certain Eleanor knew she was back to normal. This revelation made Jacinta furious because she had been foolishly running around doing everything for Eleanor to prevent her from exerting herself. After discovering the papers, Jacinta decided to go for a drive to clear her head. She left Eleanor alone at home, knowing full well that she was perfectly fine and capable of caring for herself. The hepatitis had been their only real concern. Eleanor had been managing her diabetes and arthritis for years, so she would be fine on her own. About an hour later, Clark came home and started calling and texting Jacinta about her whereabouts. He seemed upset that she had left his mother alone and gone out without informing anyone. He demanded that she return home so they could discuss how irresponsible she had been. This reaction made Jacinta even angrier, and she decided to go home immediately to confront him. As soon as Jacinta walked in, before Clark could say anything, she told him she knew for certain that his mother was perfectly healthy and that they had both been hiding this from her for the past 2 months. She explained that she wouldn't have had issues continuing to care for Eleanor, but she had a serious problem with being lied to. This wasn't even a recent development. He had been lying from the very beginning when he moved his mother in without consulting her. In Jacinta's opinion, hiding the truth was a form of lying, and he knew he had been planning this move, but chose not to tell her until it was already done, leaving her no opportunity to object. Clark was speechless. He clearly had no idea that Jacinta had found the papers. At first, he tried to deny everything, telling her she had lost her mind and didn't know what she was talking about. He was obviously attempting to gaslight her. So, Jacinta threw the test results at him and told him he had blown his last chance to apologize and make things right. She declared there was no going back because he had betrayed her trust for the final time, and she wanted him out of her house. At that point, Clark seemed to realize his mistake. He began begging her to forgive him, claiming he had been about to tell her, but didn't know how because he knew she wasn't happy with the arrangement. He said he didn't want her to make his mother leave. So, he had been confused and holding off on telling the truth. He apologized for everything, but his apologies meant nothing to Jacinta at that point. She had reached her limit. It was bad enough that Clark had been lying to her, but it was even worse that Eleanor had also been deceiving her after everything Jacinta had done for her. When Jacinta asked if Eleanor knew she was completely fine, Clark didn't even deny it. That's when Jacinta told him she wanted both of them out. Jacinta had every right to make this demand because the house was technically hers. Her grandparents had left it to her mother, who had then transferred the title to Jacinta. Clark had moved in with her after they started dating. So, she had every legal right to ask him to leave. Clark started crying and told her he had nowhere to go, and neither did his mother because he had sold Eleanor's house a couple of weeks after she moved in with them. Jacinta was shocked to her core. The fact that he had sold the house meant he had been sitting on a substantial amount of money from that sale. She knew Eleanor's house was in good condition and located in a nice neighborhood, so it must have sold for a considerable sum. Despite having this money, Jacinta had been working herself to exhaustion because Clark was too miserly to spend some of it on hiring a nurse for his own mother. She couldn't tolerate it anymore. She told him she wanted him out immediately and didn't care where he and his mother went. She just wanted them to leave. Clark tried to reason with her, but Jacinta kept screaming at him until he had to give up. Even Eleanor tried to talk to her to calm the situation, but Jacinta didn't want to hear from either of them. She screamed at Eleanor as well and forced both of them to leave the house that very day. Since then, Jacinta hadn't heard from either of them. She had already spoken to an attorney because she definitely planned to get separated from Clark. However, the only thing that made her doubtful was whether she had done the right thing by kicking them out, since some people had been telling her it was quite harsh to evict Eleanor, knowing she was elderly. Jacinta knew this was true, but she also knew Eleanor's son was with her, so she wouldn't be in any real trouble. They had money, so she was sure they would make good use of it. Nevertheless, she was having second thoughts about her actions and wondered if she should reach out to Eleanor to apologize. The people Jacinta had been referring to were actually her own family, her parents, and older sister. She took their opinion seriously, which is why she had been feeling conflicted about her actions. On one hand, she knew their criticism might be valid, and that her response might have been harsh. On the other hand, she didn't think what she did was inherently wrong because she had been forced to take such an extreme step by their deception. Her parents and sister both knew what she had endured over the past few months. Yet, they still held this critical opinion, which seemed strange to Jacinta. However, she didn't want to dismiss their perspective and claim she was right without thinking about the situation critically. After a couple of days of reflection and with most people supporting her decision, Jacinta decided she wouldn't be apologizing. She had spoken to her family about their criticism, telling them that after everything she had been through, she didn't think she had been too harsh. She believed she had been reasonable for a very long time, and expecting her to continue being nice to Clark and Eleanor would be tantamount to asking her to be cruel to herself. She had an argument with her family because they maintained their differing opinion. It was sad because now she felt lonely, seemingly on bad terms with all the important people in her life. However, she knew she was being kind to herself and doing what was right. At least her friends remained supportive. They told her that if they had been in her position, Clark and Eleanor would have been out much earlier simply because of how badly they had been treating her. Her friends acknowledged that she had put up with this behavior for so long because she loved Clark. But now she was right to have done what she did, and she was determined to stand by that decision regardless of opposition. Jacinta had mentioned in her original account that she had contacted an attorney, and she recently filed for divorce. It wasn't easy for her to take this step because she knew she was ending what was probably the most meaningful relationship she had ever had. Clark had been her first love, and even though she found him relatively late in life, she had known he was her soulmate when she met him. They had shared so many good times that it was difficult to say goodbye. However, she knew she had to do it for her own well-being because the past few months had been nothing short of heartbreaking and toxic. She had seen a completely different side of Clark that she never knew existed. He had been manipulative, selfish, and worst of all, disrespectful and dishonest. She simply couldn't tolerate this behavior anymore, which is why she believed it was better to part ways with him. The divorce terms were fairly equitable in Jacinta's opinion. They were splitting everything equally except for the house, which would remain hers. She wasn't demanding long-term alimony that she could live off for years, but she felt entitled to a certain amount of money because of all the effort she had put in over the past few months. It had been significant labor, and even if it sounded petty, she felt she deserved to be reimbursed for everything she had done. Especially now that she knew Clark had sold his mother's house and never told her, just to avoid hiring a nurse, she felt this alone entitled her to alimony, even though they had similar incomes. She had told her lawyer this was non-negotiable. Right then, Jacinta was primarily concerned about how Clark would react to the divorce proceedings. She hoped he would maintain the same cold, stoic approach he had taken since she kicked him out and wouldn't try to re-enter her life, as that would be easier to handle. She was obviously hurt that he hadn't reached out to apologize one final time, but she thought it was easier to deal with the pain this way. If he wasn't begging for a second chance, she wouldn't be tempted to give him one, and she really hoped he would just let everything go. Clark was served the divorce papers a couple of days later, and he finally decided to reach out to Jacinta. First, he called her while she was working, and she decided to ignore him because she really didn't want to speak with him. He kept calling for hours until she muted all notifications from him. In the evening, her doorbell started ringing, and of course, it was Clark standing outside with the divorce papers. He looked really upset and asked her if she really wanted to go through with this. Jacinta replied that she fully intended to proceed because after everything that had happened, she couldn't see him the same way again. Things had been ruined once and for all. She told him that for the past 6 months, he had been treating her as badly as possible, and she had been completely taken for granted. Part of it was her fault because she had unknowingly allowed him to treat her like a doormat just because she loved him and thought it was acceptable to make sacrifices for their marriage. However, she hadn't realized she was the only one actually making sacrifices. Now that she understood all of this, it was difficult for her to return to him. She requested that he leave and not try to make things right because that would make the situation even more emotionally difficult for her. After she finished speaking, Clark told her he still loved her and was willing to give their relationship another chance. He explained that the only reason he had come back now instead of reaching out over the past few days was because he wanted to give her space and time to cool down. Then he would try to make amends in return, but he hadn't realized she would take things so far as to file for divorce. He tried to convince her it still wasn't too late to fix their marriage, but this just made Jacinta sad because she could see he still didn't realize that for her, it really was too late. Jacinta explained that she didn't want to give their marriage a second chance because she had given him enough opportunities throughout the past few months, and all he had done was disappoint her. He kept promising he would change and then breaking all those promises, and she was tired of dealing with this cycle repeatedly. She became quite emotional, even though she had managed to keep her emotions under control until that point. She told him she was exhausted from having her heart broken by him so many times in such a short period. At that moment, Clark started crying and suddenly fell to his knees. This came as a surprise to Jacinta because, even though they had been together for a long time, he had never been very expressive or romantic. She had always known and accepted this because she wasn't really into grand gestures anyway. But when he was on his knees begging her to give him just one last chance, she couldn't help herself and started sobbing. For several minutes, neither of them could say anything because they were so emotional. Eventually, Jacinta told him to get back on his feet because she had made up her mind and wasn't going to change it. She told him that while she appreciated that he had finally come to his senses and was trying to convince her to return to him, she was afraid it wasn't going to be possible because she had emotionally moved too far away from him. Even though she hadn't fully moved on, she was planning to do so. She also told him that even if she somehow managed to forgive him, she would never be able to maintain good terms with his mother again because the way Eleanor had betrayed her was much worse. She and Eleanor had spent entire days together for the past 6 months. While Jacinta was at least fighting with Clark, Eleanor had been faking everything all along. While pretending to be on Jacinta's side, she had been lying to her face the entire time. In Jacinta's opinion, that was much worse and more heartless than what Clark had done. Justinta explained she could never bring herself to be nice to Eleanor after this, and she didn't want to be the kind of wife who makes her husband choose between his mother and herself because that would only lead to resentment, and she didn't want that dynamic. Clark still didn't leave. He kept trying to convince her there was still a way they could make things work and that it didn't have to end this way. Eventually, Justinta convinced him that this was how it was ending, whether he liked it or not, and she wanted him to leave instead of making the situation more difficult than necessary. After a while, he finally walked away with both of them still crying. At least they had gotten the closure they needed. Justinta didn't know how things would proceed from that point, but she really needed that final meeting. She couldn't explain exactly why, but it made her feel considerably better because she felt she had gotten many things off her chest. She had been afraid of letting him go without having this final honest discussion. Now that she had experienced it, she felt ready to let him go. Justinta was currently in the process of getting divorced. A few weeks later, Clark finally responded to the divorce papers and wasn't contesting the divorce. He also agreed to all the terms with just a couple of minor modifications. They just had to wait for the mandatory waiting period to conclude, and then they would be officially divorced. They hadn't been speaking much, limiting their communication to interactions through their lawyers. Justinta couldn't say she was over everything. She definitely wasn't, but she was trying to heal and doing everything to keep herself busy. She had also managed to reconnect with her family over the past few weeks. Her family apparently had a change of heart and reached out a few days earlier to apologize for how they had behaved toward her. They said they had had a knee-jerk reaction to what she had told them and hadn't fully understood what she had been experiencing, which had forced her to take such a drastic step. After thinking about it, they realized she hadn't been entirely wrong. Instead of supporting her during such a difficult phase of her life, they had been pushing her away, and they were genuinely apologetic about it. Justinta decided to forgive them, and they had been working to patch things up. It was going well, and she was hoping that with time things would continue to improve. Justinta's divorce finally came through earlier that week. She had been experiencing mixed feelings about it all week and decided to share her thoughts to express herself freely. Of course, she had already spoken to her friends and family about it, and they had all consoled her, telling her she should focus on the future, the usual advice. However, Justinta wanted to think about all the good times she had shared with Clark, her ex-husband. She knew it might sound strange after everything that had happened, but she didn't want to be bitter about this part of her life. If she decided to think about it hatefully, she would never be able to truly move on. She had decided to remember everything fondly and let it all go. She didn't intend to have any contact with Clark after this point, and she was definitely no longer in love with him, but she didn't want to hate him either. None of this had been easy, but she had to do it. She was genuinely relieved that it was all over, though she was also sad that it had ended. However, she was confident she would get over it. Justinta felt the need to express these thoughts, and she was hoping for the best as she moved forward into this new chapter of her life. The deception that had destroyed her marriage had ultimately led her to a place of self-respect and new possibilities. While the journey had been painful, she had learned valuable lessons about standing up for herself and recognizing when love alone wasn't enough to sustain a relationship built on lies and disrespect. Hi bestie, thank you so much for watching my video. Please share.